certified counselor in good standing. Most recently, Anissa Diab worked as coordinator for the Stand For You Suicide Prevention Program at Salisbury University's Counseling Center. Currently, Anissa works as a crisis counselor for the National Suicide Prevention Line. She also owns a distance-based counseling business at AnissaDiab.com. Highly recommend checking it out, providing one-on-one sessions to Muslim clients from anywhere in the entire country with the aim of making mental health support more accessible as well as less stigmatizing. She uses her training and professional experiences to provide workshops and trainings on topics ranging from mental wellness to understanding Islam and coping with Islamophobia. Please help me in welcoming Anissa Diab.
Peace be with you. I'm so honored to be here tonight speaking at this wonderful event. It's my first time at Cornell, and I just applaud the amazing work that your campus is doing in terms of addressing mental health stigma. Can we just give a round of applause to everyone who made this? Today I'm here to share my story. I was born and raised in Salisbury, Maryland. Growing up, it was a small town, not a whole lot of Muslims there. My father is from Tunisia, which is a small country in North Africa between Algeria and Libya. My mother is a convert to Islam. She is American. Her family has been in this country for generations. And my grandparents on my mom's side are Christian. They remained Christian until they passed away. And my husband is from Lebanon, so I often joke that our family is like the United Nations because we represent a little bit of everybody. But I did learn at a young age that Islamophobia, or the dislike or prejudice against Islam or Muslims, especially as a political force, was a part of my heritage. If many of you may be familiar with the history of Spain and the time that Muslims ruled over Spain, they had actually been ruling over 800 years and brought in what was known as a golden age. And so when the Spanish conquest happened, or in Spanish, la conquista occurred, anyone who was not Catholic was forced to flee from that country. My family was included in that on my paternal grandparents' side. And so many of them fled to present-day Tunisia. Now, what's interesting is that Muslims weren't the only ones who were exiled. You also find that Jews were exiled as well. And what was interesting to see in Tunisia, and especially in the town that my father is from, which is called Testour, is there was really this coming together of different faiths and working together to build a community despite the diaspora of what they had experienced. If you go to Testour, Tunisia today, in the center of the town, you will find a mosque. And this mosque is actually called the Great Mosque. If you look at its minaret, there is the Star of David on the minaret, which is pretty interesting. But it really symbolizes the unity that took place between these two faiths. And it's a beacon of hope for the loss that this community had to experience and the historical trauma they had to endure. These are the stories you don't hear much about. The other day I had a conversation with a Muslim friend of mine. She's a mother of 2 young boys. And she said to me in a concerned voice, she said, Anissa, have you ever thought about what we would do, where we would go, what country we would travel to, if things became unbearable for Muslims living in this country? I told her I had thought about that. But I think it's a sad thing that these are the types of conversations that we are having amongst sympathy because I know that Muslims are not the only members of our community that are feeling that way. I know there are other people as well in this country during this time that are feeling very unsafe, right? We have Hispanics that are feeling unsafe, Black folks, LGBTQ individuals. But I say this because we really do need to ask ourselves what side of history we're going to be on. When our children ask us one day what we did in this climate of bigotry to counter this oppression, what are we going to say? How did we use our actions to do so? The paradigm that I had mentioned earlier of what happened to my ancestors in Spain, of people being exiled from their country due to their faith, was really never something that I had entertained as being possible here in the United States, living in the 21st century. Until this current administration and some of the laws that we've been seeing, such as the Muslim ban. But I told my friend to have hope, right? I told her not to allow bigotry and Islamophobes to rob her of her current peace and joy, especially when this may be something that never happens. But I think as Muslims, as members of this community, especially whenever there's an act of terrorism that happens, this is always a thought that's in the back of my mind, that what if we become persecuted because of what somebody has done in the name of Islam who doesn't even represent Islam? We're constantly worried about the backlash that we're going to face by somebody who doesn't even represent our religion. We do know that hate crimes have increased. This is something that has been surveyed across the country since 9/11, since the attacks in San Bernardino, the Paris bombings. We have seen a triple increase in hate crimes towards the Muslim community. 9/11 was a huge turning point in my life. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I was a student in middle school. I was in my band class when my instructor told us to put down our instruments. And he just, in a very nonchalant way, said, "The World Trade Center has just been attacked." Again, he said it in such a calm manner that I didn't think much of it, honestly, and I think the other students were calm as well. It wasn't until class was dismissed and I was walking out into the hallway that I began to sense the fear. I could smell the fear. I could feel it. I could see it on everyone's faces, the panic. That what was happening was serious. When I went into the next classroom, I looked at the television, it was turned onto the news, and what I saw was something, it was a nightmare. It was something you'd think it's from a movie, it's not reality, and yet it was reality. And I remember feeling incredibly unsafe that day, as I know other students felt the same way. Parents were coming to pick up their kids from school early that day. And I remember walking into the kitchen and my mom saying to me that from now on, you cannot tell anybody that you are a Muslim. You know, being Muslim was part of my identity, and that really propelled me into a crisis of not only identity but spirituality. I knew why my mom had told me that. She wanted to protect me. She didn't want me to face any backlash. She didn't want me to get hurt because people misunderstood my faith. After all, we know that the first person to be killed in a hate crime as a result of 9/11 was a Sikh man who was not even Muslim but mistaken for one due to ignorance simply because he wears a turban on his head. But I needed to know the facts because I told my mom, I said, I can't follow a religion that teaches that killing innocent people is okay. I needed to know if these people really represented my faith. And this was the time before Amazon, so it was not easy to get your hands on books. But I said to my mom, I know there's a bookstore where they sell books on Islam an hour away. It was in Dover, Delaware. And I said, let's go. I need to read. I need to know. So I began to research. And the more I researched my faith, the more I fell in love with my faith. The more I realized these And I decided that I wanted to embrace a part of my faith that I hadn't really, I don't want to say followed, but adopted before full time. And that was wearing hijab, the headscarf that you see me wearing now, as well as dressing more modestly. I was hesitant, really hesitant, because wearing hijab would mean that I would be the only person in my whole school wearing it. I lived in a small Eastern Shore town. And of course, many of you know that in high school, you want to fit in. You want to do the exact opposite of stand out. Then I thought about it some more. And I started to realize that my hesitancy was coming from caring more about what people think of me than what God thinks of me. And that didn't sit right with me. So I decided I was going to come back from Christmas break and wear a hijab. I was doing the exact opposite of what my mom told me to do, which was not to tell anyone I was Muslim. Because there was no hiding anymore, right? Once you wear a hijab, or if you're, Jewish and you wear a yarmulke, or you're a Catholic nun and you wear a habit, I mean, everybody knows you're Muslim, or you're Catholic, or you're Jew. So I was done hiding. I was tired of it, and I wanted to embrace my faith in all its aspects. The biggest surprise for me, as a 14-year-old, white-skinned woman speaking fluent English, was that I had made an unconscious choice to lose the privilege that I had and unknowingly had. I became a foreigner in my own country. I was suddenly being asked constantly, "So where are you from?" By random strangers too, like in the elevator, like just about everywhere. And I'm like, people really weren't that interested in where I was from before. All of a sudden, I became an alien in my own country. And when I would tell people, "I'm from Maryland," "Where are you really from?" "You can't just be from there." "No, before that." "Okay, where are your people from?" And I think it's so important to recognize that this is not just my experience, but a lot of other Muslims whose families have been in this country for generations also experience this sort of microaggression where they're made to feel an alien in their own land. And I think we've got to address this. You can be Chinese and Muslim. You could be Irish with curly red hair and freckles and still be Muslim. You can be American and Muslim. Muslims are not a homogeneous group of people, and yet we tend to assume that people who are not from here must look a certain way. I think this confusion between culture and religion, which are separate, is part of the reason why there is so much confusion about Islam and Muslims, especially knowing that most non-Muslims get their information about Islam from the media. At the same time, I realized that people of different faiths needed a safe space to talk about their issues. And so in high school, I started an Islam Awareness Club, which was an opportunity for people of different faiths to come together and talk about the misconceptions and their own beliefs as well, their own faith backgrounds. And so we had Christians, we had Jews, we had an atheist, we had a Mormon. Boy, did she have a lot of misconceptions to talk about in her faith. And it got media coverage because it was so controversial to do this in a small town. But I've realized that in life, bad things will always happen beyond our control. It's not about preventing those bad things from happening as much as taking something negative that's happened and trying to find a way to make it positive and to do something about it. Fast forwarding to life as an undergraduate student in college, I became president of the Muslim Student Association, which was a great way to really counter the stigma with Islamophobia. apparently it's a great way to meet a husband as well, because that's where I met my husband on Mass, who's here with me today. But we held interfaith events, and it was wonderful. And what was so heartwarming to see was that as many of you here have gathered here today from other faiths together, most of our members were actually non-Muslim in the MSA because they wanted to be allies and they wanted to stand up against the ignorance that was present. So that was heartwarming to have that allyship, not to say that we didn't have our fair share of opposition as well. Many students do reach a point in their college career where they decide to change majors. I was one of those students. When I realized being a bio major also meant that you had to be good at chemistry, that's when I knew I was not in the right field. Though my first chemistry lab had triggered an academic crisis within me, I'm grateful it did, because it resulted in me meeting with a career counselor, somebody I actually call a great mentor today, who helped me see my calling was really psychology and ultimately becoming a counselor. My true passion was to provide people with a safe space to discuss their issues and to also provide a safe space for anyone who's been discriminated against or mistreated for what they believe. And it was only fitting because looking at my own life, the people that had helped me the most were counselors. People in my high school, my guidance counselor who backed me up and supported me in starting an Islam Awareness Club. My career counselor in undergrad who helped me realize that biology was not going to be my major. And whenever I had even kind of difficult situations in life, it was really my mentors in the mental health and psychology field who had given me clarity in those dark moments. My first semester as in graduate school studying community counseling, I will never forget when my professor looked at everyone in the class and said, "Don't even think about graduating until you have gone to see a counselor yourself. If you want to be an effective therapist, you need to work on your own issues." What? Me? I don't have any issues. I mean, I'm in this field to help other people, okay? I do not have any issues. As an adolescent Muslim youth, I was taught that to go see a counselor, to rely on somebody else to try to teach me how to be strong in a difficult situation, meant that I was weak, right? It was actually a very anxiety-provoking thing to think about being on the other side of the chair to work on my personal issues. It turned out to be the best advice I could have ever been given in graduate school. Of course, I did go to see a counselor, and it has made me a more effective therapist today. But it made me realize something, that opportunity, not only did it help fight the stigma that I had within myself as somebody who was studying counseling, but it made me realize just how hard it must be for folks to go walk into a counseling center and talk to somebody they've never met before about their problems, right? It takes an enormity of courage. I have noticed over the years that Muslims consider themselves, many, not all, to be immune to mental health related issues. But we all know that mental illness does not discriminate. Looking at the mental health trends in the Muslim community, we see issues like depression, anxiety being the top two. We see issues related to acculturation and identity. Do I call myself Muhammad or Mo? Do I call myself Ibrahim or Abe? How much do I take of my parents' culture? How much do I take of my faith? Other issues we see are, especially in the immigrant population, post-traumatic stress disorder, especially considering some of the war-torn countries that these folks might be coming from. And despite alcohol and recreational drug use being forbidden in Islam, it is still an issue where we have Muslims in the community abusing alcohol and opioids and marijuana. And believe it or not, suicide does happen in the Muslim community, but it is highly stigmatized to talk about. I I was recently invited to a mosque in Michigan where a young man had ended his life by suicide. And they invited me because they wanted to have events addressing the stigma associated with it, because when they came time for the funeral, hardly anyone has shown up to this young man's funeral due to the nature of his death, which is very sad if you think about that. And then I began to excavate other ways in which the Muslim community deals with mental health issues and some of those myths. For instance, the notion that prayer is the only solution to any mental health issue that you're going through. That people experiencing mental health problems are struggling because they're dealing with the evil eye or devil possession. That being a straight A student or doing well academically means that everything is fine mentally by default. That if you're struggling with mental health issues and you're single, it means we just got to find an auntie or uncle to get you married so they can make you feel better. That a person who ends their life by suicide is automatically going to hell. And the list goes on. Suffice it to say, there were a lot of misconceptions to debunk in the Muslim community. And again, this is not to say that all Muslims believe this, but it is especially common to believe that depression is a weakness of faith. In graduate school, in my training, I became fascinated by suicide. Why do people choose to make this permanent decision? How can people be in so much emotional distress that they choose to end their lives for good? If you think about all the people who fight for their lives, even if it means losing their home, leaving their loved ones, how could there be so much pain and suffering where a person decides to resort to suicide? 6 years ago, I became a suicide prevention coordinator at Salisbury University, and our goal was really to reduce the risk factors associated with suicide on campus, but also to get the conversation going about mental health and reduce stigma. To be honest with you, I wasn't really sure the Muslim community was ready to have this conversation. After all, there were all these barriers to treatment. For instance, Muslims mistrusting counseling providers for fear of discrimination or not respecting their faith values. In fact, I would even hear of imams on the pulpit during Friday prayer saying, if you have a problem, don't go see a therapist because they're going to take you away from their religion. There's a lack of understanding in the Muslim community as well about what counseling is and what that process is like. Oftentimes there's a misconception that it is somebody giving you advice, telling you how to live your life, whereas it is actually somebody helping you develop the tools and the insight to be able to rely on yourself and develop that resilience within. There's also a fear of treatment. Is this provider going to force me to take medication? Are my parents going to find out that I'm seeing a counselor? Will my professors find out that I'm seeing a counselor? And how is that going to affect my grades? How do we begin to address all this? A year after having my daughter, I moved up here to Syracuse, New York. And although my position as a suicide prevention coordinator had ended, I knew that this conversation needed to continue to shatter the stigma associated with these issues. Soon I found myself not only striving to shatter the stigma associated with being Muslim in a post-9/11 world, but also the mental health stigma present within the Muslim community. I began to realize that the two go hand in hand, because we all know that religious intolerance has a negative effect on mental health. In fact, research does show that individuals who are bullied or discriminated against are at increased risk for depression, anxiety, substance abuse issues, and even suicide. What happened when I started going to mosques and Muslim youth camps and other organizations to talk about these issues truly amazed me. I'll share a story that I was at one Muslim youth camp. And, these were teenagers, and I was giving a talk about mental wellness, and we were talking about the difference between stress and an anxiety disorder. And one of the symptoms of an anxiety disorder is self-injury. All of a sudden, lots of these young kids started raising their hands. Why do people self-injure? I don't understand that. Many of them were asking me questions about that. I said, that's interesting. I don't normally get a lot of questions about that, but I'm glad people are asking questions. After the end of my presentation, a young boy really, walked up to me. And he said, Sister Anissa, can you just close your eyes and hold your hands out? I said, no. He said, no, trust me, it's okay. Nothing bad. And something told me in my gut, I could trust him, so I did. He dropped some tools in my hand and said, this was me, and walked away. The tools that he had dropped in my hand were what he had been using to self-injure. Whoa. Not only was the Muslim community ready to have this conversation, it was a long overdue conversation. And this was a common theme I had seen in many of the presentations afterwards, with youth coming up to me saying, thank you for even talking about this. We don't know who to turn to. Our parents don't understand us. And that's why I continue to do these talks. And I'm happy to see that these topics of mental health are gaining traction in the Muslim community and the non-Muslim community as well. My daughter's 3 years old. She's 50% Lebanese, Tunisian, 50% European descent, but she is 100% American. When I see the research today indicating that 1 in 3 Muslim students is fearful of identifying as Muslim for fear of bullying or retaliation, when I see that 55% of Muslims report being bullied in school due to their religion, 1 in 4 of those incidents by school staff, in a country where mass shootings have become a norm, and we have a president who says it's okay to punch people in the face, it is an understatement to say that I am deeply concerned for her and deeply heartbroken by what's going on. And it's not just for my child or my daughter, and I'm not just concerned for her whether or not she'll feel confidence to identify and be strong in her faith. I'm concerned about what the next generation is going to represent. Because I believe Islamophobia is not just a threat to the Muslim community. I believe it is a threat to all communities. When we allow one group of people to be marginalized for their faith, the color of their skin, their gender, or whether or not they are struggling with mental illness, we are essentially opening up that door for everyone. For now, I'm choosing hope. And I choose hope partly because I believe all of you in this room are going to go out there and be the change, and that's why I continue to go out and do these talks. I work as a crisis counselor for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The day that Trump became president, we received one of the highest volumes of calls, our manager told us, following the death of Robert Williams. People were in significant distress. The mood that day in our office was very somber. Answering calls from the Lifeline is never a dull moment. Sometimes people call because they're having a bad day and don't have anyone to talk to. Sometimes I've had calls where a person is on the side of a bridge asking me to give them one more reason to live. Indeed, I found it ironic that while some people blame me and my faith for the loss of lives on 9/11 or other incidents of terrorism, that I find myself using a different form of the 911 digits to help save lives when callers need rescue. And it's something I'm very proud to be a part of. The work we do on the Lifeline is not just life-changing, but life-saving. As a licensed mental health counselor, I've had people come into my office and refuse to work with me when they see I'm wearing a headscarf indicating that I'm Muslim. As a professional, I know what it's like to be discriminated against, even when you're trying to help other people. The interesting thing is working on the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, people don't know what my beliefs are, right? I use an alias. Obviously, no one can see me through the phone, and so I sometimes wonder if people would even continue to speak with me if they knew I was Muslim. And yet I remind myself that that's not what really matters, because I found that the only way to shatter stigma is to show people who you are through your words and your actions. Finding your voice means identifying a wrong that needs to be corrected. And that's a question I would pose to all of you here today. What wrong have you noticed in your community that needs correcting? How can you use your voice, your talents, to advocate for this issue? Because wherever there's shame, there's silence, and where there's silence, there's stigma. I had a conversation with a Native American man at a suicide prevention conference that I attended recently. I was walking by the tables and he said, "Excuse me, I see you've got a headscarf on your head and you must be Muslim. Why are you here?" I said, "Thanks for asking the question. I see you're Native American, and knowing that suicide is a big issue in your community, that the Native Americans have the highest rate of suicide in any cultural group, compared to any cultural group in the country. I thank you for posing the question." And I said, "I'm here because my faith teaches me that every single life is sacred. In the Quran, it states that to save one life is to save all of humanity. One life. And it doesn't specify only white lives, or Arab lives, or Muslim lives. No, one life. And it's not about the numbers. You help one person, you help save their life, it's as if you saved all of humanity. Being Muslim and being a human being has taught me that in order to truly help people, you need to be willing to get out of your comfort zone. If you don't know a lot about Muslims or Islam, go to a Muslim Student Association club, or the Mecca, I think as it's called here, and talk to folks and get to know them. If you don't understand what it's like to have a mental illness, and you find out a friend of yours is struggling, don't be afraid to ask them questions. Try to truly understand what it's like. Working as a counselor, I've come to learn that we may be of different faiths and different backgrounds, but every single person in this room knows what it's like to be in distress, to feel unsafe, to have a bad day, to lose a loved one. I would be amazed to find on the Lifeline that many times I would have several calls in a row with people sharing very similar concerns to the person that I had just spoken to a few minutes before. And I would sometimes think to myself how wonderful it would be if all these people could just get together and support one another. Of course, that couldn't ever happen, but we do have to realize that when people are struggling with mental illness, or they're even struggling with any kind of life crisis, they feel like they are the only ones in the world going through that issue, even though they are not. Part of creating an inclusive and harmonious society is for us not to look just at our own mental health, but to ask ourselves, how can we care about the mental health of our neighbors? How can we be concerned about the mental health of those we don't understand? It's to ask our community, what are the faith-based misconceptions or barriers to treatment that are preventing our friends of other faiths from seeking help? Avoiding discussions around politics or religion for fear of offending others is not something to do anymore. These discussions are part of what it means to be caring human beings. And whether you are misunderstood due to your faith, culture, orientation, or because you are struggling with a mental illness, when we reflect on the humanity of each individual within us, that's when the walls of stigma begin to shatter. I thank you for being an ally by supporting the Muslim community and being here today. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. So we just heard some powerful words from Ms. Lucia. Thank you again. Can we get another round of applause? So Ms. Diab talked a lot about mental health, her own experiences with her identity growing up, and how it affected other people and how they treated her, and also later on in life how she saw how it affected other people. Mental health not only within herself, but within her community around her, within other people around her, from experiences that she had with people who have committed suicide to people who self-inflicted pain upon themselves. So I think now we want to take the time to open the conversation to everyone else, so that you all can talk about mental health in your own communities in relation to your identities. And we're also willing to start serving food, so we're going to be sending a couple tables at a time to go get some food.